The Ashen Forge had their 100th episode with Steven Sharif and asked him about 55 questions is what I counted in my Google document, which you can find on my Discord. What I'm going to do is break this out, and I'm going to try to have timestamps for each of these. So if you want to go into the video where it was actually said, because I'm going to try to cut the responses down to just the core response as well. So if you want the full response without the editing, I will have the timestamp for that. So the first one was a question about building on freeholds, and the response was something we already knew. You need blueprints, gold, and materials. And then they followed up with, when bidding for a freehold plot, what do you need? And I had assumed it was just gold, because that's kind of what they had said. However, it sounds like it's gold and potentially another currency, or at least that's kind of what they're considering.
Right now, that's a little bit point of discussion. We have two approaches that we're going to be testing. One is going to be that certain freeholds are available just through gold auctioning, and then the other system is that there are going to be certain locations that are available both through gold and through a other metric, which would be either character bound like certificates that you acquire, or favor, or another mechanic, currency mechanic that you have to acquire through personal effort. And we're going to see if that works out well in addition to the system. So there's kind of two approaches there: gold only, and then gold plus bound performance metric, which would be that separate type of currency.
Yeah, because part of where that came up was people asking questions about like religious nodes. You know, are they really going to spend gold, or is there some other way using the actual node type as a way to procure a freehold?
Yeah, I'm kind of being sensitive not to touch on a couple of topics that we haven't yet revealed. So for example, you bring up a religious node. We have this concept, you know, in other games that we played, where you have these like PvP type honor systems. And that's kind of an individual currency that you acquire through performance, through multiple quests or arena systems, right, that we've experienced. And then you use that currency to purchase unique either gear that's limited in time or whatever, right? We have a similar concept that we're going to be utilizing across different types of nodes, potentially. And in the religious node that you mentioned, one of those concepts is something called favor. And favor is acquired through participating in certain religious quest lines, through repeatable activities that you can achieve it, and through turning in certain types of material acquisitions to acquire the favor.
This next one is, will the community know once testing has started? And Steven here very shortly mentions that PI testing has not even started yet for Alpha 2, which, to be fair, I kind of knew, but most people I don't think know that the PI people, the people that paid like $1,000 to test this game, they're not even testing it yet.
That's a tricky question. I would say no, not all the testing. There are Phoenix Initiative testings that have occurred in the past, not for Alpha 2 yet.
And then a question on parcels and plots. And I had a big question about this after the Freehold stream, kind of outstanding in my own head. And I think a lot of people had this question because it was a little bit unclear the way they described it. Steven described it as a big area that you bid on, and you can place your freehold anywhere in that county-sized area. And there sounds like there's several of these surrounding the node. So that kind of clarifies that. However, I do have some worries about how that system might work, where people waste space, and how many plots are they expecting to be put down within those county-sized areas. That's something that I kind of still am worried about with that system.
Oh, this is one of the things that I wanted to add into the article that we were planning to release last week with some graphical representation of how that parcel systems works. But essentially, imagine the parcel as more like a county that exists around the node, right? And so if you have a node in the center and you have its zone of influence around it, that's a mass group of land, okay? And then if you were to take a county line marker and create counties around essentially the node, that is what you would be bidding on.
This was a very big one. I don't think we knew this yet, and I have read the wiki multiple times and made an 1.5 hour long video on everything known about Ashes of Creation. I'm pretty sure we did not know that the death penalty for green players in the open seas is actually lower than it is in other areas of the game. And I think that was something they did as a compensation for forcing players to be flagged as a combatant in these areas. So I think that's a compensation for that.
If you are not corrupt and you enter the open seas, then you will be taking a mitigated form of the death penalties, which means you will have a debuff applied upon death, and in addition, you will still suffer the gear degradation or gear decay upon death as well. But you will essentially be either significantly reduced in the experience debt accrued through death in the open seas if you're not corrupt, or there won't be experience debt accrued in the open seas if you are not corrupt.
So is it the same as green or even less than green?
Even less than green.
Okay.
This next one was about permissions on the processing stations on your freehold, and basically it's going to be your social groups, your guilds, your families. This is what we knew, and this was something that people were worked up about. However, they're considering maybe offering more permissions. It's just something that's going to be based on testing.
There is an outstanding question on whether or not we should provide permissions to members who are not a part of a social structure. And what I mean by social structure is not just that, hey, I found, Joe Blow on the side of the street and he needs access to this thing. I'm just going to open it to public, the permissions to public. Personally, I don't think that achieves the goal of the system. I don't think that that's a desired quality. I think that we need to have a more formalized structure in place, which is given through the family system and or through guild systems. And I think that is how we're going to initially test it and see how we get feedback and how it implements around the desires of progression for that particular system. And so what that means is you'll be able to provide permissions to those social groups, not to anyone.
And then they asked about crafting and processing stations on your freeholds. Will there be decay or atrophy? And Steven said this is something they might do, but for now it's just taxation, which I'm pretty sure we already knew this, but the idea that they are thinking about maybe adding decay is something I think that is new.
That's something that we're still discussing internally. It is coded in such a way where it's an easy variable for us to kind of change, that there are material components that are necessary to kind of feed the machines to keep them up and running, or it could be based on how you interact with the fuel components. If you overcharge with fuel, that can create system degrade similar to your armor decay, which then you have to feed materials in order to rebuild maintenance wise. Right now, it is not implemented with that in mind. The only maintenance required is going to be through taxation.
This next one was about crops, seeds, animals, and pets. Do they exhaust in terms of new offspring? So if you've had several generations of offspring, will you start to get less seeds or offspring? And it sounds like, yes, there will be diminishing returns, but mounts do not degrade.
Do you exhaust a line? So do I always get a seed from a plant, or do I always get a pet from a parent, or do you eventually get to where...
Not always.
Okay, so eventually you just have to start over.
There is a diminishing return, so to speak, within the system. So it is not 100% self-revolving in that sense. There is going to be a diminishing return, which then requires the player to go and interact with the world again in order to supply and support the system.
Would that include mounts, things like that? Does your mount eventually...
The mounts are a little bit of a touchier subject. I'm not sure how many players... I mean, me personally, and I use this as a guiding metric, of course, as I'm helping to design these systems. Do I want to see my trusted mount, Seabiscuit, die or get retired or turned into glue? No, that's a touch point with the player that's I think a bit controversial. So mounts do not degrade over time. Once you have a mount, you own a mount.
And then summoners and bards, will they be in at the start of Alpha 2? And rogues were also included in this later in the video. And bards will be in at the start of Alpha 2. Rogues will be in at the start of Alpha 2. Summoners are the only class that are not scheduled to be in at the start of Alpha 2. Also, the Tulnar models were asked about, and it sounds like they will not be seen this year. Possibly we'll see them next year.
So I think that on the schedule that bards will be intended to be present at the start of Alpha 2, but summoners will not. And I believe that the Tulnar will not be this year, but will be next year.
I think they're wondering about Rogue too, but I think we were expecting Rogue for Alpha 1, so
Rogue
probably
is
again would
scheduled
be,
to also be at the start of Alpha 2 as well. Yeah, the
yeah.
only
Oh, neat.
the only archetype that's not scheduled currently to be at the start of Alpha 2 is Summoner.
Now this I think we heard about in April in the community Q&A. What systems need to be rolled out before Alpha 2? Basically, Steven said that most systems are in the game, they just need a lot of polish and content added to them.
You know, a lot of it's content. I'm not sure that it's a feature. It's a feature one. I can't think of any large system features that haven't been stood up from a core functional perspective that don't just need expanding on / content development on.
Similar to that, Naval Combat. Is it being worked on? Is it done? The core functionality is done. A lot of things need to be done in terms of water physics, weapon attachments, things like that.
Yeah,
Does-
from the vehicle perspective, right? When we're talking about the ability to attach the vehicle component to a particular type of ship or whatever, like that has been developed from a core functionality perspective. Now, when we talk about how do we emulate the physics movement of the vessel in the water, that still needs to be done. How do we have certain mechanics like the attaching of particular types of weapons on the vehicle? That still needs to be done. But naval combat is something that is in and of itself a very intricate system, and it shares a lot with our general vehicle system, such as caravans and mounts that are utilized within the code. So.
And then coastal nodes and naval assaults, will they be possible? And we knew that this was a thing that they had talked about before. However, now they're thinking about this might only be done on nodes that have a harbor. And he specified that only one of the 5 coastal nodes that advances the fastest will take that harbor and have the harbor. So it's the most advanced node on the coast will have the harbor and will potentially have objectives during the siege, and the rest of the nodes on the coast will not have objectives during a siege.
Yeah, we've gone back and forth a little bit on whether or not the design intent for sieging of nodes is intended to include, for certain nodes, the naval component. The concern there was that it would be a difficult thing to balance around that particular node having accessibility from the water for those types of defenses. So what we've kind of presented is an opportunity where harbors are the focal point of those naval interactions. And during sieges, you are aware that nodes have certain objectives which have ramifications and can influence the outcome and or the ongoings of a particular siege against a node. And if one of those objectives is a naval objective because that node might own a harbor, which is a point of interest that gets adopted by a node which advances far enough around it, right? So you might have one harbor and 5 nodes that can own that harbor, and the first to hit the village stage adopts the harbor, right? Then that can become an objective key point during a siege that has naval interaction. So that's kind of the direction we've moved towards, rather than allowing the naval component to interact directly with sieging the node itself, as opposed to being a part of the objective-based gameplay that exists for a node siege.
And that's all that I found interesting in the Ashen Forge podcast. Overall, it's a good podcast. I thought some people were worked up about the questions asked, but that's always going to be the case. And hey, if you're really, really, really bored, there's a new ArcAge Classic private server with supposedly no pay to win, and they've made some adjustments to the formula in terms of faster labor, bigger labor cap, and those sort of things to kind of adjust some of the issues the game had back then. But it's a classic version before the game was ruined in many cases, at least according to the community. So it looks like a pretty good server, and hey, maybe it'll work out. It probably won't, because nothing ArcAge ever seems to work out, unfortunately, but it might be fun to play for a few weeks. I've been playing it. Just started playing today, actually. I haven't gotten very far because I had to make this video, but if you jump in the Discord, I might be playing it. I might even be streaming it on Twitch. I've been streaming it some on Twitch as well, so come check that out if you're interested and want something to do. With that, guys, I'll see you in the next video.